sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey, everybody. Looking forward to today's episode. Today we have Kenneth Hite. He should be on any minute, so we will have a chance to learn a little bit more about him. There he just entered into the waiting room. But very quickly before I admit him, I have finished AD 100 a few months ago. It is available. That's 100 never before either published or uncollected Avram Davidson stories. So if you're a big Avram Davidson fan and you didn't know this yet, go buy AD 100 volume 1 and 2. Again, 100 unpublished and or uncollected Avram Davidson stories for his 100th birthday. Today, we're going to be listening to Inventors in Unhistory, Who Fried the Phoenix, and I am going to admit Kenneth momentarily. Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, I love your background.
Yep.
Obviously, like to collect an occasional book.
One or two every now and again.
And how are you? Are you tired? I know you just got back from Brazil from a gaming convention. It'd be interesting to learn about that and kind of what you do. That's a great way to introduce yourself, I think.
Well, the game convention in Sao Paulo, Diversão Offline, brought me down as a guest because I was lead designer on the most recent edition of Vampire the Masquerade, the role-playing game. And I'd designed another game, Night's Black Agents, which ironically is about hunting vampires, that also I think was just new at the show from its Brazilian publisher. And so I think a couple of those strands coincided to bring me down to Brazil. And that was just amazing. On the one hand, it's a game convention. And like I say, I design role-playing games professionally. So I've been to a million game conventions, but it's in Brazil, which I've never been to. So it was I don't want to say it was a land of contrasts, but, you know, the sort of, you know, crowd of fun, happy gamer nerds is like one sigma prettier if they're in Brazil, I guess is the big difference there.
How did you get started in the whole gaming career? I mean, I find that fascinating in terms of your background.
Well, I mean, I really fell in. I was a 12-year-old in the 70s, which is, I think, the important key for everything. So Dungeons and Dragons, Bermuda Triangles, King Tut, UFOs, all of that was in the mix. And it's really just, you know, pick one or pick all. I picked all and started playing role-playing games with Dungeons and Dragons, and then Call of Cthulhu and other games. And eventually a friend of mine who I'd played games with had a job as a game editor and sent me a manuscript for an entirely different game from a different company. And I wrote about 11,000 words of feedback on it. And the publisher of that company, Chaosium, said, "This is great. We're using it in the book. We're paying you. What's the next book you're writing for us?" And so that sort of began a career, or at least it began a side gig. And my wife said, "You know, you're so much happier writing games than you are working for the insurance company," which was my, you know, deadly day job. Why don't you write games full time? And I said, "Because we need money for electricity and food." And she said, I think that it's better to have you happy and maybe get, you know, the cheaper food. So that was her decision. So I switched over, began doing it full time, and have so far, you know, kept the lights on and the refrigerator full, which is my contribution.
That's amazing. I'm great. It's great when you can find something you love, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, the people who say, you know, find something you love and you'll never work a day in your life, they're still wrong. If I didn't have to work, it would indeed be a perfect job, but there is a lot of labor involved in putting out, you know, a game book, writing it, playtesting it, doing everything else. And then, you know, lots of other side hustles and whatnot to keep everything, all the plates spinning. And in the course of things, I've also written some nonfiction mostly about the writer H.P. Lovecraft, who I know Avram did not particularly care for as a person or as a writer, but which is odd because they both have, seen from the outside, so many similarities as writers, beginning with their, obsessive, going off on side trails, their love of research for its own sake. I mean, the vocabulary alone is very similar in that they deploy it, not that they have the same vocabulary. So it's always sort of been a personal wound to me, and I get where he's coming from, that he did not like Lovecraft, but I think an appreciation for Lovecraft is part of what gave me an appreciation for what Davidson was doing with his writing as well.
That's interesting. So yeah, taking a step back, I mean, first of all, you've been incredibly kind and great words and supportive of everything that I've been doing. At least that's how I found you, was on Twitter, just every time something goes up, just praising it. And so for that, I thank you.
Well, I mean, you kind of led with some really strong stuff, so.
No, I really appreciate it. So tell me, I mean, going back in history, how did you discover Avram?
Well, I mean, we discussed my 12-year-old self. I was a big science fiction reader, of course, and I'm sure I read Avram stories in collections and anthologies, but the first thing that I absolutely remember reading and saying, holy cow, this guy, was actually, I think, Who Fired the Phoenix, the first of the adventures in Unhistory, because I don't know if it was my grandmother, somebody had given me a subscription to Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, which was one of the two big science fiction magazines back in the day. And he published the first of them there, and it was just a lightning bolt. And I was already, wired to absorb that kind of thing. I was, as I said, a Dungeons and Dragons kid. So here's a guy writing about a monster. It was just, a bolt of lightning. And then very soon after that, a good friend of mine, Jeff, said, oh, you like Avram Davidson, have you read the Esterhazy series? And he had that very old paperback of the Esterhazy series, and he loaned that to me.
That falls apart. Every copy I've seen is, I haven't seen.
Just if you breathe on it, it comes to pieces. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. I was so glad when the hardcover compilation came out, so I could finally put it back in its bag and never have to touch it again. But I mean, those two, and then like I say, I'm sure I'd run into all the other great ones as they got anthologized. But it was basically discovering adventures and then reading the Esterhazy that really made me aware of him as a writer with a body of work that I had to obsessively chase down, which is basically what I've been doing my whole life now since then.
Wow. Well, so going back a little bit, you mentioned something, and I'm curious, and memories not serving me well here, but with Lovecraft, did he actually say he didn't like his writing, or just not him as a person?
He there's a bit in, I think it's Masters of the Maze, where his character, which is of course Avram doing his own stream of consciousness, is musing about the bad smell in the colonel's basement. The colonel, of course, is this horrible racist Freemason or whatever he is.
Right.
And he says, a bad smell, that reminds me of the work of Lovecraft. And he does like 2 paragraphs of just surgical demolition of H.P. Lovecraft, and then goes on. So maybe it's just the character saying it, but I have never come across, and I've looked a little bit, him saying, no, that was just a work. I actually love the old guy. I just don't think that was the case.
Yeah, I don't think he particularly thought the person was a wonderful person.
Nor need he have thought that, in all honesty and fairness. Yeah.
So I mean, with Avram, and we're going to get into the specifics of Who Fired the Phoenix in a minute, but what do you think makes him special to you in general?
I mean, in general, first of all, he is, I I think there's a John Clute quote somewhere that calls him obtrusively literate or obtrusively well-read. I like that. I love that in a writer. If you're Peter Ackroyd, I love it. If you're H.P. Lovecraft, I love it. If you're Avram Davidson, I love it. And so just that willingness to lead with this great body of other work that has made you is, I think, something that a lot of writers are either scared or too illiterate to have done. And I love it when someone does it. And also the sort of the tone, it's you can shorthand it as avuncular, but it's more than that. It's like, the best guy you ever met in a bar telling you stories level of tone. And that runs through the adventures, it runs through the Esterhazys, it runs through the Lime Killers. All of it is just this sort of, well, I'm going to tell you a story. You may not believe it. It may take a while to get there, but it'll be worth it as long as you're buying. And it's such a great, and when you read them in a slightly different meter, like a house, the Boss on the Wall, or some of the harder SF, the earlier stuff that he was, cranking out to make Rent. It's still there, but it's sort of, there's got a little bit of a curveball on it. But I think once you've read his voice, really, if you love it, you'll follow it everywhere. And if it bounces off you, then, there are those whom the word falls on who do not hear. It's just the way the world is.
I do think from my perspective as someone who grew up trying to read his material, I was one of those. Again, I started at 12 and couldn't read it. But then later on, as I got older, certainly found more of appreciation. And now I just have absolutely fallen in love with it. So it is, I do think there is if you give it a few tries, like trying to read Shakespeare, I always say it's like trying to read Shakespeare for the first time without any context. That's pretty hard.
It's a job without footnotes.
Right. If you go a few times, you're like, wow, this is actually pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And certainly at the time, I had no idea anyone could write like that. I mean, to the degree that he does. Even Lovecraft would have said, come on, get to the point at some point. And and Davidson is like, the story's not about the point. The story is about the story. And this is how it's going to get told. And I mean, when I was reading, I think the first Peregrine novel, Peregrine Primus, I almost didn't want the sort of the exposition and the layout to end. I was so wrapped up in it, the way that he was sort of building that completely classically true but also fantastical, Middle Roman Empire. I fell in love with it. It's just so engaging and so strong, and everything he writes is at least touched a little bit by it. And even the stuff that's one or another tone off, or not off, but tone different, is still you can find it in there and you can follow him, and it works even better because he's a master.
Well, thank you for speaking so eloquently about him.
Yeah, I mean, it's the least I can do. You can't really come on and say, Avram Davidson, good. Sort of have to.
Well, you ready to listen to Who Fired the Phoenix?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Who Fired the Phoenix? In my heart a phoenix flame darts and scorches me all day. Robert Graves' Song of Phoenix Flame. Here it begins, the work of love breeding among red embers. Robert Graves' The Hearth. That strange, odd book, The Secret Languages of Ireland, by R.A. Stewart McAllister, which the syndics of the Cambridge University Press caused to be printed in 1937, contains a section on the slang or cant of the stonemasons of Dublin in the early 1800s, when these workmen still spoke Irish Gaelic amongst themselves. For the most interesting only as urban survivals of a language already beginning to die out, even in the countryside. But one sentence strikes me as being worth a citation. Duce vreissa qui apera quilin tunuga carain eig alpoliera. I saw, better have seen, pigeons bringing fire to boil meat at Dublin, apparently a crude piece of rustic irony invented for the purpose of snubbing a boaster. I hope to point out evidence of its meaning much more than that. Before I begin doing so, I will ask that we consider the year 1934. Of a decade which began in the Great Depression and ended in the Second World War, it may be said that no year was a good year. However, let us take our scientifictional time and space scanner and, peeping backwards, zoom in briefly on a few randomly sampled items. Item: a theologian in Rome studies St. Cyril on men's unbelief. Item: a schoolboy in Australia observes a bird doing something odd with ants. Item: a newspaper reporter in England is reproved for bringing in a silly story. Have these 3 items any connection? Not for that year alone, and not even for that decade, but for any year and any decade? It is almost certainly true that anything in this psychomaterial universe is connected with any other thing in this psychomaterial universe. Therefore, what are the connections which link these 3 items? Where shall we begin? As is my habit, I quote Charles Fort, that intensely normal-looking man who spent 40 years collecting reports on the abnormal, and he said, "One measures a circle beginning anywhere." He might have added, though in doing so one must avoid circular reasoning. What has any of this to do with the phoenix? And before even beginning to try to answer that very pertinent question, let us not forget the advice of Socrates: define your terms. Let us begin, then, by asking, what is the phoenix? I have had some personal and slightly painful experience in taking for granted that everyone knows at least something in the way of an answer, even if only via the byword, to rise from one's ashes like the phoenix, for example. Some years ago I wrote a novel entitled The Phoenix and the Mirror, which was described by one critic as Baroque fantasy. Several years later, I spoke with a young woman who had recently read it. Our conversation, it soon became clear, contained some elements of confusion. And soon later, as we continued to converse, it became clearer that she had never heard of the legend of the phoenix, not even via the byword. No, she thought that I had made it all up. She flattered me. I hadn't. Anyway, I hadn't made it all up. The book was writ by magic, but the book and its magic are not the subject of this lecture. Let us begin, then, by reading an abridgment of one of the versions of this very old legend, that of Lactantius. Sometimes he is called the Christian Cicero, a comparison which probably pleased Lactantius more than it might have Cicero. And sometimes it is said that Lactantius never even wrote the poem from which my very brief abstract is taken, and if so, as to who did write it, why, I have no idea. I didn't. There is a happy spot, retired in the first east, where is the grove of the sun, planted with many a tree. There is a fountain in the middle, clear, gentle, and abounding with sweet waters. This grove, these woods, a single bird, the phoenix, inhabits, single, but it lives reproduced by its own death. It obeys Phoebus, son of Apollo, the sun-god, and when the phoenix has accomplished the 1,000 years of her life, and the length of her days has become burdensome, in order that she may renew the age which has glided by, full of years, she directs her flight swift into Syria, to which Venus herself has given the name of Phoenicia. And through trackless deserts the phoenix seeks the retired groves, where a remote wood lies concealed in the glens. There she chooses a lofty palm, which derives the name of phoenix from the bird, and where no hurtful living creature can break through, or slimy serpent, or any bird of prey. She builds for herself a nest or a tomb, for she dies that she might live. Rich wood she heaps together, cinnamon and balsam, cassia and the fragrant acanthus, rich drops of the tearful frankincense, tender ears of spikenard, and the pleasing myrrh. Then, amidst such various odours, she yields up her life, nor fears the faith of so great a deposit. But her body, though destroyed by death, is hot, and the heat produces a flame. It conceives fire, it blazes, and is dissolved into burnt ashes. And from these ashes comes a worm, and this increases vastly into an egg, from which the new phoenix, having burst its shell, shoots forth, even as a caterpillar is wont to be changed into a butterfly. Her colour is like the brilliancy of the red pomegranate when ripe, such colour as the red poppy produces in the fields beneath the redly blushing sky. O bird of happy lot and fate, born from herself! Happy she who enters into no compact with Venus, goddess of love and matrimony. Death is Venus to her, her only pleasure is in death, so that she may be born, she desires first to die. She is an offspring to herself, her own father and son, her own heir, and always a foster-child of herself. She is herself indeed, but not the same, since she is herself and not herself, having gained eternal life by the blessing of death. Well, not without beauty, either of description or concept, a fable. Even fables may mean something. What does this one mean? Leaving aside mythology, can we submit this to a process of absolute rationalization and come up with something? Something sensible, that is, and which we can believe? Try this. Long ago, someone saw a bird fly into a nest. Unknown to him, also in the nest was an egg about to hatch. Suddenly the bird died. The nest burst into flames. The heat of the fire hatched the egg, and... not very satisfying, is it? Why does the bird suddenly die? Natural causes? Oh, very well. The bird suddenly dies of natural causes. Happens all the time. Yes, but how does the nest suddenly burst into flames? Spontaneous combustion? Well, I suppose. And since I am supposing, I suppose I might as well suppose that the heat of the fire lasted just long enough to hatch the already ready-to-hatch egg, and then went out, by natural causes. But what? The newly hatched hatchling couldn't have had any feathers, let alone those as red as the pomegranate and the poppy. Newly hatched birds have no feathers? Oh, very well, then. If you're going to spoil my nice rationalization with such comments, I will have to admit that part of it couldn't be true. The passer-by must have made it up. It is strange how reluctant we are to credit ancient and/or distant people with imagination enough to simply make up a story. We make them up all the time, and often they don't mean a thing, not a thing. But perhaps you are unwilling to admit this. Everything means something. The subconscious mind, for example. Well, having brought the subconscious mind in, let us, since we have failed to rationalize this story, proceed to psychoanalyze it. It is an erection fantasy. It is an archetypal account of copulation and birth, not rebirth, just birth. We know that die is a colloquial word for orgasm. and we have read Jorge Luis Borges's story, The Sect of the Phoenix, in which immortal life was granted to the members of the sect by virtue of their performing a somewhat squalid act, into the performance of which they may be initiated even by children or servants. And we may even know that Borges himself has said that the secret of the sect of the Phoenix is simply copulation. What more do we need? We need, for one thing, a further examination of this legend, which has from ancient times taken such a hold upon the minds of mankind. Unlike such legends as those of the werewolf, or even of the mandrake, this one, that of the phoenix, seems at least to be, and to have been, completely harmless. But it may be none the less fascinating. It might lead us somewhere. It might lead us nowhere. Let us at least see. Let us, for example, see what the theologian in Rome saw when he read the writings of St. Cyril in the year 1934. St. Cyril wrote, long before that year, God knew men's unbelief, and therefore provided this bird as evidence of the resurrection. You see that no less an authority than one of the fathers of the Church, far from dismissing it as a pagan fantasy, accepted the phoenix as an actuality, as had many others in authority done, both before and after Cyril. There were, of course, sceptics. For example, here is Herodotus, a most learned and well-travelled native of Asia Minor, and of Greek descent, much called, in case you didn't know, the father of history. Had he, in his travels, learned about it? He had visited Egypt, and in particular Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and wrote some comment on the Egyptian veneration of the goose. Yes, the goose. You and I might not, I think, care to venerate the goose, but we might, and then again we might not, prefer it to venerating some other of the creatures of which the ancient Egyptians were so fond, say, the crocodile. It might certainly be safer, for one thing. And the father of history goes on to say, There is another sacred bird named the phoenix. I have never seen it myself, except in pictures, for it is exceedingly rare, only appearing, according to the people of Heliopolis, once in 500 years, when it is seen after the death of its parent. If the pictures are accurate, its size and appearance are as follows. Its plumage is partly red and partly gold, while in shape and size it is very much like an eagle. They tell a story about this bird. The phoenix is said to come from Arabia, carrying the parent bird encased in myrrh. It proceeds to the temple of the sun, and there buries the body. In order to do this, they say that it first forms a ball as big as it can carry, then, hollowing out the ball, it inserts its dead parent, subsequently covering over the opening with fresh myrrh. The ball is then exactly the same weight as it was at first. The phoenix bears this ball to Egypt, all encased, as I have said, and deposits it in the temple of the sun. Such is their myth about this bird. I have left out a few words. I shall now tell them to you. Herodotus says, Personally, I find it incredible. And well he might. He, however, leaves something out. Did you notice? Nothing said here about the phoenix being burned to ashes and then being reborn out of them. Well, Herodotus didn't have to tell us everything he saw and heard. After all, how much were they paying him? Now, I would point out a few things. For one, note that the funeral of the dead phoenix took place at the Temple of the Sun. Note, too, the mention of it being encased in a ball. We all know that among the many creatures venerated by the Egyptians was the scarab, a large beetle, and the scarab is shown time after time rolling the sun like a ball across the sky, which is why it was sacred. But what so many of our books fail to say is that the scarab, in entomology as distinct from mythology, The scarab beetle is a dung beetle. And I can tell you, for I have seen it myself, not in Egypt, but in the Holy Land right next door, I can tell you that what the scarab rolls along the earth is a ball of dung. It forms such a ball. I saw it done out of camel dung near the ruins of the Philistine city of Ascalon, and then it gets right up on its hind legs, and it rolls it. It keeps on rolling it along. And why does it do this? No myth or secret. The scarab doesn't care who knows. It rolls this round ball to a place of its choice, and then lays its eggs next to it, in another and pear-shaped blob of the same stuff. And the warmth of the decomposing substance, like the warmth of the sun, helps the baby scarabs to hatch. Also, it provides a hot lunch without federal subsidy. So it seems that the ancient Egyptians seem to have given the phoenix some of the characteristics of the scarab, and if we had never seen any scarabs ourselves, we might well say that they were mythical, and that personally we found the story incredible, as in part about rolling the sun it is. They also seem to have tidied up the tale a bit. Myrrh, for example, is ever so much nicer than manure. Well, with the phoenix appearing in Egypt only every 500 years, people had lots of time to think about it, and to think of improvements. As it happens, 500 years after Herodotus, and on the other side of the Mediterranean, lived the exiled Roman poet Ovid, who wrote, "All these receive their birth from other things, but from himself the phoenix only springs. Self-born, begotten by the parent flame, in which he burned, another and the same." So, if the poetic element of fire wasn't there in the legend in the time of Herodotus, it certainly was there by the time of Ovid. And it is this part of the legend which has endured. People tended to forget about the big ball of myrrh. They tended to forget the filial piety of the blessed bird in bringing his father all the way to Egypt for a big funeral at the Temple of the Sun. What people did tend to remember was that the phoenix built a sort of special nest, somehow caused it to catch on fire, was burned to ashes, and out of the ashes was somehow born anew. It is, after all, a metaphor of supreme vividness and strength, and to it was added yet another element. That is, not only did the phoenix, which by now was not seen as being dead when its nest caught fire, but as being alive, that not only did the phoenix somehow start the fire, the phoenix was thought of and depicted as fanning the fire, upon which fire it was consumed, only to rise again. So one is not altogether surprised to read in one medieval bestiary, a book of beasts with each creature being described not exclusively in terms of natural science, but in terms of metaphor and allegory as well, of religion that is, one is not altogether surprised to read the following passage. "The phoenix, know this is its lot. It comes to death of its own free will, and from death it comes to life. Hear what he signifies. Phoenix signifies Jesus, son of Mary, that he had the power to die of his own will, and from death came to life." And yet, about 2,000 years after Herodotus, that wise man of Norfolk, England, not Virginia, Sir Thomas Browne, M.D., did find it necessary to include these lines in his book Pseudodoxica Epidemica, or Inquiries into the very many received tenets and commonly presumed truths. "That there is but one phoenix in the world, which after many 100 years burneth itself, and from the ashes rises up another, is a conceit not now altogether popular, but of great antiquity, not only delivered by humane authors, but frequently expressed by holy writers, by Cyril, Epiphanius, and others. All which, notwithstanding, we cannot presume the existence of this animal, nor dare we affirm that there is any phoenix in nature. For first, there wants herein the definite tests of things uncertain, that is, the sense of man. For though many writers have much enlarged hereon, there is not any ocular describer, or such as presumeth to confirm it upon aspection. Primitive authors, from whom the stream of relations is derivative, deliver themselves dubiously, and either by a doubtful parenthesis or a timorous conclusion overthrow the whole relation. As for its unity, or conceit that there should be but one in nature, it seemeth not only repugnant unto philosophy, but also holy Scripture, which plainly affirms there went of every sort at least two into the ark of Noah. Every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort, they went into the ark, and two of all flesh, wherein there is breath of life. It infringeth the benediction of God concerning multiplication. God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and let fowls multiply in the earth, which terms are not applicable unto the phoenix, whereof there is but one in the world, and no more living than at the first benediction. As for longevity, that it liveth 1,000 years or more, besides that from imperfect observations and rarity of appearances no confirmation can be made, there may probably be a mistake in the compute. For the tradition being very ancient, the conceit might have its original in times of shorter compute. For if we suppose our present calculation, the phoenix now in nature will be 6th from the creation, and but in the middle of its years. And if the rabbine's prophecy succeed, it shall conclude its days not in its own, but in the last and general flames. A consoling thought. Now, as this may be generally considered a Protestant view, and as we have already heard what might be generally considered a Catholic view, are there any Muslim and Jewish views? Indeed there are. The 11th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica tells us, Among the Arabs, the story of the phoenix was confused with that of the salamander, and the samand or samandal, from whose feathers a fire-proof cloth is woven, the salamander, of course, being able to live in fires, and not minding in the least being regarded as the source of asbestos. The samand or samandal is represented sometimes as a quadruped, sometimes as a bird. A four-legged phoenix. Allahu Akbar. Dr. Maurice Burton, the British natural historian, upon whose book Phoenix Reborn this adventure depends, almost if not quite in its entirety, for reasons you will get to see, Dr. Burton says, The rabbins tell us that all the birds, save the phoenix, shared in the sin of Eve, and ate of the forbidden fruit. As a reward, the phoenix was given not immortality, but this modified form of immutability. Legend, we see, supported the fable of the phoenix. So did poetry. So did, anyway, the old-time religion, although the new-time religion and the new-time science were doubtful. The French naturalist Cuvier, early on in the 19th century, suggested that the phoenix was actually a pheasant, precisely the golden pheasant. Certainly, in ancient times, the golden pheasant was not known outside of China, and its plumage in a way resembles that attributed to the phoenix. But if it was not known outside of China, how could it have become the subject of a legend most widely known in the Near or Middle East and the Mediterranean? Cuvier suggests that, well, somehow, one might have, so to speak, lost its way. It is a long way to lose, but there is nothing absolutely impossible in the suggestion. However, how often could this have happened? Cuvier seizes on this very point. It could not have happened often, he argues. Hence the belief that the phoenix appeared only every 500, at the minimal calculation, years. I find this somewhat circular reasoning, personally, Still, let us for the argument agree that in the appearance of the crimson and golden pheasant lies the origin of the description of the phoenix. But how about the rest of it? There is, to be sure, a Chinese legend of the phoenix, but the comparison of our legend of the phoenix vanishes while you examine it. I know because I once, briefly, lived in China, and it vanished while I was examining it. The fact is, alas, that European visitors in China, observing that the Chinese had a legend of a marvellous red bird too, in effect cried, "The phoenix!" The Chinese were very polite to foreigners, when indeed they were not cutting them into very small pieces, and so, very politely, they decided that this must be the proper foreign word for their own legendary bird. But that is about all. T.H. White, better known for his The Once and Future King, translated a bestiary, and in his own commentary on the phoenix says, very calmly and casually, that it was probably the purple heron called Bennu. He casually and calmly fails to mention that Bennu is pronounced Vini in modern Greek, and was perhaps so pronounced in some of the ancient Greek dialects too. As for X, the Greeks often added it to foreign nouns ending in vowels to show that it was a foreign noun, and hence not requiring to be grammatically declined, as Greek nouns were. Example, the apocryphal book of Jesus the son of Sirach. White was, in his turn, very probably repeating the suggestions made by other and earlier writers on the subject of this fantastic bird, the phoenix, which made itself a nest of spicy and pungent and aromatic plants, and then, fire somehow being introduced into this nest, fanned the fire with its wing, and perished in an ecstasy, only to rise from its ashes reborn. Suggestions which suggested that the bird in question was indeed a heron. What is the connection? Here is one. The heron was known to make its nest in the tops of palm trees. So was the phoenix. In fact, and we should take note of this, in the Old Greek the word for palm tree was the same as the word for phoenix. Remember that Lactantius says that the tree derives its name from the bird, but may it not be the other way around? Palm trees, after all, are common in hot countries, and even in those merely warm, whereas one thing which all writers insisted on about the phoenix is that it was not only uncommon, it was exceedingly rare. It does seem likelier that the rara avis took its name from the unrare tree rather than vice versa. Shakespeare, in his poem The Phoenix and the Turtle, refers to the bird of loudest lay, of song. That is, as in the lay of the last minstrel, let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, and so on. It is not meant to imply that there was only one tree in Arabia, but that, I think, the tree of the phoenix was unique, as was the bird. As to why the bird of loudest lay, or song, well, it was another part of the legend that the phoenix, as it died, sang a song of exceeding sweetness. And I suppose it must have sung loudly, as well as sweetly, because as it proceeded from Arabia, or Phoenicia, which is adjacent, into Egypt, it was accompanied by flocks of other birds, perhaps alerted by the song, as well as by the red and gold glory of the bird's plumage. Now, it may not have escaped attention that there is at least some resemblance between the words Phoenix and Phoenicia. The matter is complicated, and I shall proceed to complicate it still more. The Phoenicians did not call themselves Phoenicians, but many people are commonly called by names other than their original names for themselves. The Hungarians call themselves Magyar. The American Indians, for example, never thought of themselves as Indians, And nowadays many of them prefer to call themselves Native Americans, as though the rest of us were all born somewhere else, and for that matter as though the word American were a Native American word, which it is, after all, not. However, the ancient Greeks it was who called the coastal people of what is now Lebanon and Syria by the name of Phoenicians. It means the red ones, so to speak, from the Greek phoinos or poinos. Remember the Punic Wars? They were the wars between Rome and Carthage, a Phoenician colonially founded city in North Africa, and we are usually informed that this name of Red Ones was given because the Phoenicians were sunburned by their long voyages at sea, which they made to bring the Greeks not only the alphabet, but such trade items as glassware and copper, which is, by the way, red, and the famous Phoenician Tyrian dye, which is almost invariably referred to as purple dye. As a matter of fact, its colours ranged quite a way along the spectrum, and included blue and red. And red. The phoenix was also red, but the purple heron was, well, purple. I have never seen a purple heron, but I have in Sausalito, California, seen a blue heron, several. They are a sort of blue-grey. And some authorities are insistent that it is a mistake to connect the purple heron with ancient Egyptian bird worship. It was the grey heron, they say. However, there is no grey phoenix. I have cited T.H. White in his The Book of Beasts. Now let me cite Richard Carrington in his book Mermaids and Mastodons. He begins by quoting our old and so well-read friend Pliny the Elder, who said that the body of the phoenix was a deep red purple, and that on its head it had a tuft and plume. Carrington points out that the purple heron does have, anyway, a plume on its head indeed, and that it was one of the symbols of the sun god at Heliopolis, which, remember, was the very place whither the phoenix brought, in one version, the body of its father for burial. T.H. White seemed to see no further problem, and even Carrington glides away from the subject. But there is one obvious and even matter-of-fact objection, and that is that the heron, far from being seen only once in 1,000 or even 500 years, is seen all the time. Something seems to have been lost in translation, but I am not yet ready to leave Carrington. In prehistoric times, he says, when men sought gods in the forces of nature, a bird deity was the obvious choice to symbolize the sky, for birds were the only creatures who naturally belonged to that element. One had not to be a theologian in order to take the tempting trail to either symbolism or allegory, which are, after all, brother and sister, in an attempt, so to speak, to lift the veil of Isis. In other words, decide what these ancient stories really meant, and the most popular method was to declare any one of them a nature myth. And of these, the most popular was to say that something, anything, was a solar myth. Applying this to the phoenix, let us admit at once, or anyway almost at once, that the phoenix lends itself really very easily to definition as a solar myth. It is red and yellow, it does die, and it is reborn, all just like the sun. But to go back to the myth of the scarab, which none of these writers whom I have quoted seems to have done, the Egyptian myth of the scarab, which rolled the great globe or ball of the sun across the sky, this is not as glamorous as the Greek myth, which has Apollo driving the sun as a chariot across the sky. How natural to assume, as many of the ancients did assume, that it was from the iron shoes that shod the chariot horses of the sun that there came sparks, and that it was these which ignited the funeral pyre of the phoenix. It seems, somehow, to make sense, almost, until we pause and realize that, after all, there are no horses up there in the sky. There are no stones up there in the sky either. Hence, of course, stones cannot fall from up there down to here, to earth. Hence the wise men of former times were quite right to deny the existence of meteorites, and they did deny it, and went right on denying it well into the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson denied it, and when a couple of members of the Harvard faculty announced all the evidence, Jefferson said, "I would rather believe that 2 Yankee professors have lied than believe that stones fall from the sky." He was a great man, but here he is wrong. And perhaps, if you think that what I mean to imply is that it was meteorites shooting or falling stars which ignited the nest of the phoenix, well, perhaps you too may be wrong. And when we consider the melody of the dying phoenix, this inevitably brings to mind the legend of the dying swan and its swan song. And, of course, it was also said that swans it was that drew, sometimes, the chariot of the sun, and not horses. After all, a singing horse would be a bit much. However, I am not yet finished, really, with the scarab. My typewriter made a mistake right at this point, and for scarab wrote acrabs, and acrab is the Hebrew and perhaps the Arabic word for scorpion. I intend to do nothing whatsoever about this. I shall return, as I said I would, to the scarab, the insect of the sun. Insects lay eggs, and the eggs turn into caterpillars, or grubs, or maggots, or, well, worms. And in the case of the phoenix, the process was reversed. The worm turned indeed. It turned into an egg, and the egg into another phoenix. If we knew nothing of birds, would we believe that they produced eggs? If we knew nothing of eggs, would we believe they produced birds? Down to the age of Shakespeare, a certain European goose was never known to produce an egg. Its goslings were never seen by man, and the universal explanation was that it hatched at sea from a certain crustacean, hence its name of barnacle goose. Evidently the barnacle looked vaguely goose-like enough to support such a story. Not until very late in the 16th or very early in the 17th century was the immense and frozen archipelago called Spitzbergen or Svalbard discovered or rediscovered. Men went there for whales, and they found the whales, but they also found something else, something seen more or less for the first time by the eyes of man, namely the perfectly normal nests and eggs of the so-called barnacle goose, there above the Arctic Circle. The argument ex silentio on which this almost nursery rhyme had been based was destroyed by the squawking of, may I say it, Mother Goose? But no voyage to what was then called the East Greenland Seas destroyed in the slightest the mysterious veil, and perhaps it was the veil of Isis, which hung in tantalizing gauzy drapes all around the fable of the phoenix. The sign of the phoenix appeared in the elaboratorial MSS of the alchemists, and hung over the doors of the apothecaries. The 17th century gave way to the 18th, and the 18th to the 19th. The sign of the phoenix was employed even by, of all antic notions, fire insurance companies. But the mystery of the phoenix remained unsolved. John James Audubon. Everybody knows the name of Audubon. Not everybody knows, however, that he once planned to go into the steamboat business on the Ohio River with a young English immigrant named Keats, a brother, as a matter of fact, of the poet Keats. The steamboats, however, so to speak, never got off the ground. Audubon probably lost his money. Keats in America certainly lost his money, and Keats in England wrote to him, "I am afraid that Mr. Audubon is not a very honest man." Winona McClintock, another and a later poet, wrote, "Keats had TB, Shelley drowned, Shakespeare lies in the cold, cold ground." Audubon, meanwhile, not much knowing what else to do, began to paint birds. Before long he had enough for a book, but before long, too, he realized that there weren't enough customers for it in America. He went to England. We may suppose he did not bother to call upon the Keats family for a subscription. He went to Scotland. In Edinburgh he called on, among other people, a prominent local surgeon. I quote from memory. He came to me directly from his dissecting room, with the blood still wet upon his hands. His manner was most gentlemanly and agreeable, and he promised to help me in my endeavours as most he could. The surgeon, I will now reveal to you, was a Dr. Knox. In fact, he was the Dr. Knox, and the source of the bodies in the dissecting room, whose blood was still wet upon his hands, will not bear examination. So let us examine it. As bodies were essential to the study of medicine and surgery, and as the only bodies legally available for the purpose were those of criminals who had been hanged, a supply which had begun to dry up anyway, a professional corps, shall we say, had grown up of grave robbers. They sold their robbed bodies to the medical profession, and they were known, not as Dickens's Jerry Cruncher preferred to be known, as, to wit, agricultural character, but as resurrection men. Shades of the phoenix, eh? Times had been very hard in Ireland, and God knows they must have been very hard for people to migrate thence to Scotland. We well know that most Irish people are the salt of the earth, descendants of kings and princes, pious, sober, and learned. However, two of them were not any of these things. One was named Burke, and one was named Hare, and in order to make the rent on their, shall we say, studio apartment, called in the porky Scots dialect a button ben, and located in Tanner's Close, I regret to say that they proceeded to murder the many guests who found hospitality with them, and whose delectable corpses they sold to— but surely you know the verse. I wants to make your flesh creep. I'll recite it to you. Up the close and down the stair, Button Ben with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, and Knox the boy who buys the beef. From Keats at one end to Burke and Hare at the other, Audubon was certainly connected with a lot of very interesting people, one way or another. And taking another way, let us consider what else he had been doing. He had been watching wild turkeys, and what they had been doing. This was in the good old USA, in one of the eastern states, perhaps Kentucky. I now quote Maurice Burton, from whose book Phoenix Reborn I have quoted before. He says that Audubon spoke of the turkeys rolling themselves in deserted ants' nests, and then he quotes Audubon for the reason. To clear their growing feathers of the loose scales and prevent ticks and other vermin from attacking them, these insects being unable to bear the odour of the earth in which ants have dwelt. Well, this is interesting. This is very interesting, because, do you remember, one of the random samples which we took of the year 1934 showed a schoolboy in Australia seeing a bird doing something odd with ants. This, however, lay a bit in the future of the year 1847, when Mr. Philip Henry Goss published the book Birds of Jamaica. One of these birds is the Barbados blackbird, also called the tinkling grackle. I think that only the English could come up with a name like the tinkling grackle, yet be that as it may. Goss described how the birds would often go and gather limes bruised by falling off trees, then stand on one foot and rub the oozing fruit under the opposite wing, then switch to the other leg and apply the lime beneath the wing on the other side. Was the blackbird, or if you insist, the tinkling grackle, was the bird by any other name concerned with possible under-wing odour? Burton says, this bathing might go on for an hour, and was presumed to have as its aim the application of the aromatic juice of the lime to the feathers. Odd. 30 years later came a report that a tame crow was seen deliberately to take its stand on an anthill and allow the ants to crawl over its plumage, seize parasites in their jaws, and bear them away. This sounds a little like the accounts of the small birds, which are alleged to roam freely upon the crocodile in order to pick things from its teeth. Burton says, referring to the bird accounts, "During the next 60 years there were a number of similar stories published in a variety of journals, scientific and otherwise, but no self-respecting ornithologist believed them. They were in fact treated, like the myth of the phoenix, as wholly fictitious." The year is now 1934. Peter Bradley, an Australian schoolboy, writes to a Melbourne newspaper to say that he had noticed starlings picking up ants and stowing them away among their feathers. And this letter is read by A. H. Chisholm, who is working on a book called Bird Wonders of Australia. Chisholm does not altogether believe the story, but, Pete being persistent, Chisholm is impressed enough to add a note about it to his book. I now switch from the historical present to the past. The note was read by Professor Erwin Stresemann in Europe, who published it in a monthly magazine about birds. Letters poured in, not just from schoolboys either, and in a short time the practice was acknowledged not only to exist, but to exist in many different kinds of birds. It was named anting. It still is called anting, although it is now clear that the birds which ant do not always use ants, but we will get to that. The bird, as observed, evidently hundreds of times by now, picks up an ant in its bill and, spreading its wings, rapidly rubs the ant along, usually the inside of its wings, which are widely extended. In this position, the quills or primaries, i.e. the primary feathers, of the wings are fanned. A Canadian observer, the ornithologist Roy Ivor, is quoted as saying that when the anting process is at its height, the birds seem to be afflicted with an ecstasy, toppling onto one side or in other ways losing their balance. A similar report comes from Holger Poulsen, whose observations at the Copenhagen Zoo include those of 152 birds representing 85 species belonging to 24 families. He reports that the birds sometimes rub the ants on their tails and shoulders as well as wings, often becoming so absorbed in the task as to lose balance and fall over. These observations include birds in the wild as well as in captivity, and well might the question be asked, did birds only start anting rather recently? The obvious answer must be certainly not. And to the next question, then why was it not noticed before? The answer, not so obvious to those who have not seen anting, is that it is all done very quickly, far more quickly than it takes to describe it. Probably no trained ornithologist noticed it, because none was looking for it, and, such is the general attitude of specialists of all kinds, observations reported by non-specialists who had noticed it were brushed aside. Stories of birds applying ants to their feathers were regarded by ornithologists much as herpetologists regarded and regard stories that snakes form themselves into hoops and roll down hills, or suck the milk from cows' udders. Old wives' tales, we call them. However, young Peter Bradley was wrong in believing that the birds stow the ants in their feathers. They do not. They never let go of the ant till they have finished rubbing it. Then they either eat it or simply drop it. Furthermore, close observations show that the ants are not used to eat the smaller parasitical insects, bird mites or bird lice, which are usually found in plumage, and in fact in implying that young wild turkeys wallow in old ant nests because their parasites will drop off, not liking the smell of ants, Audubon was also wrong. In which case, or cases, why do the birds who ant? I have said a bit before that, although the name of anting is applied to such behaviour, not ants alone are used. We have seen the custom of the Barbados blackbird, or tinkling grackle if you prefer, I do not, in using bruised limes for the purpose of rubbing its feathers. Are any other items used? Oh, you bet. Herewith a partial list. Pine needles, pepperina berries, English walnuts, lemon pulp, lemon juice, vinegar and beer, orange juice, choke berries and sumac berries, cigar stumps, roaches, shrimps, moths, mothballs, tobacco pipe ashes, chimney smoke, a smouldering log, apple pieces or apple peel, pansy blossoms, hot chocolate, soapy dishwater, cigarettes. Perhaps this list is long enough, although probably other items are also used. It is evident that although the practice of anting may be innate or instinctive, the items used are fortuitous. That is, a bird may engage in anting with whatever it may chance to find around. As I so often quote Maurice Burton as the prime source for this adventure, I will say that I know of him only that he is an Englishman, a doctor of science, and the author of several books, including Infancy in Animals, Animal Courtship, and Animal Legends, as well as Phoenix Reborn. It is in connection with his pet birds Corby, Jasper, and Niger that he came to write the book, which brought to my attention by Professor Robert McCubbin of the College of William and Mary inspired this adventure. But before going into that, let us take our science-fictional time and space scanner and zoom back to the year 1934 again. A reporter on an English provincial newspaper is reproved for bringing in a silly story. Silly stories are most common in what newspaper men call the silly season, usually the dog days of August, but can turn up all around the year, any year, and may range from, I heard this one phoned in one night to the office of the old San Francisco News Call Bulletin, a phantom aeroplane crashing into the Golden Gate Bridge. There was no aeroplane and hence no crash. There was a bridge, though. To a cat reported to have walked 30 miles between its old home and its new. The cat had walked perhaps the 3 miles actual distance between the two houses, or perhaps had simply been away a long time on business of its own. Flying saucer stories are usually silly stories, but not always. Stories of elephants being dragged underwater by giant sharks are invariably silly stories, with the added factor of originating too far away to be tracked down. Stories of people who are 120 years old are almost invariably silly stories, as Randall Garrett once said to me. People over 112 years old always have in common that they have no birth certificate. To which I might add that if they do, it is almost certainly someone else's birth certificate. This particular silly story was about a house which caught on fire because a bird had picked up a lit cigarette and carried it to its nest in the rain gutter of the house in question. It was explained to the reporter that such stories, though not terribly uncommon, were terribly untrue, because birds do not pick up lit cigarettes, let alone carry them off to their nests, cigarettes being inedible. See? I hope you see. Rocks do not fall from the sky because... Burton's theory is that anting is an extreme form of preening, and that it is related to an extreme form of sunbathing. The bird does it because it feels good. I might go as far out on a limb as any bird, and suggest that it may be remotely related to what in human beings is called fetishism, but I won't press this point. Bird anting seems also related to aspects of bird bathing. In both instances the bird seems to go into an ecstasy, sometimes. And now I shall ask you to recall that Lactantius, in his poem on the phoenix, says that it bathes the day before it burns. I shall ask you also to recall how many of the substances, or items rather, with which birds engage in anting are, or might be considered aromatic, or anyway strong-tasting or strong-smelling substances. Pine needles, pepperina berries, English walnuts, limes, lemons, vinegar, beer, orange juice, cigar butts, shrimps, mothballs, tobacco ashes, smoke, apple, hot chocolate, cigarettes. Add to the adjective aromatic the adjective spicy, and something like a revelation occurs. Of what did the phoenix build its nest? According to all the old reports, and there are, after all, no new reports, it built it from such items as cassia, spikenard, cinnamon, balsam, frankincense, and myrrh. In other words, out of substances aromatic to the smell and spicy or pungent to the taste. And if balsam and frankincense and myrrh sound ever so much more romantic than tobacco, beer, vinegar, lemon, lime, and orange, recollect that legend placed the phoenix in Arabia, and that southern and south-eastern Arabia was of old the chief source of frankincense and myrrh, and that it lay along the trade routes along which passed such odoriferous items as cinnamon, cassia, spikenard, balsam. One employs what may be available, whether one is a phoenix or not. As to the rather obvious matter that anting, whatever it may be, and whatever motive it may have, is not, repeat, not nest-building, I can only reply, no, it's not, is it? Birds sometimes go into what we term an ecstasy whilst anting with ants. They go into this ecstasy sometimes whilst bathing or preening. Sometimes this happens when they have merely seen ants, and this happens sometimes when they are applying a variety of other items to their bodies, and sometimes when, though they make all the motions, they have absolutely nothing at all in their beaks. And in the state which we, perhaps anthropomorphically, term ecstasy, they tremble and extend their wings, and make odd and curious movements, and sometimes, whilst doing this, they fall down, don't they? Well, yes, they do. We human beings sort of regard the prime cause of ecstasy as sexual, but there are many other causes. However, is anting and its frequent resultant ecstatic state connected with sexual activity among, that is, birds? Evidently it is, but not terribly closely. Some of the movements are similar to those observed in mating dances, but only some. So we must look for other cause or causes. And we must also remember that old Lactantius told us that the phoenix bathed before it sat upon its magic nest and burned and died, whereas Burton and others tell us that birds who ant frequently bathe after they ant. Well, Lactantius and others got the order of the egg and the worm wrong, so another error in the matter of sequence need not astonish us. Onward. Do birds perform in this ecstatic manner whilst sunbathing? Sometimes. And do they bathe afterwards? Sometimes. We do say, sometimes, of aromatic or spicy substances, certainly of pungent ones, that if too strong, they burn. Pliny the Elder complained of the loss of currency to Rome in importing immense quantities of pepper from India, when the pepper's sole function was, he said, to provide a slight burning sensation to the tongue. Perhaps something of the sort happens when a bird ants. Perhaps the formic acid in the ants, or the essential oils in the fruit rinds, or whatever, provides somewhat of a burning sensation, which the bird finds intensely pleasurable. The same thing might be said of the heat of the sun whilst the bird is sunbathing. And the same thing might be said of the anting birds which pick up lit cigarette butts and apply them to themselves, or which ant in the smoke of smouldering logs, or upon the tops of chimneys, or even in the steam of kettles. The common factor is, then, heat. However, what of the birds who go into wing-flapping ecstasies while preening after being rain-soaked when it is not hot, or whilst bathing in water on a cool day? Ah, there you have me. And there, I believe, you may have everybody else concerned in this whole complex subject. The picture, you see, is not complete. And, incomplete as I have shown it to you, there is nonetheless something left out, something of intense importance. Maurice Burton had a pet rook, a bird closely related to the crow. Corby was his name. This family of birds has long been known to be rather intelligent, although it did not seem particularly intelligent of Corby to dance in front of the fireplace when the logs were burning, so close that the fireplace had to be screened. Corby was subsequently seen to turn on the electric heater for his pleasure, and even to pick up wooden matches in one claw and peck them until they burst into flame. Then he would hold the matches one by one under his wing and ant. Now, Corby was not the only bird that Burton had, and one of the others was a blue jay named Jasper. A lit cigarette butt came within Jasper's reach one day. He played and toyed with it a moment, then Jasper went into the full anting display in a most dramatic fashion. He brought his wings forward to their full extent, the wings curving inward in front of the body, so the tips almost met in front. The magnificent colouring of his wings was shown to the full, and his whole pose was statuesque. This display lasted less than a minute. Remarkable, to say the least. Now, as Dr. Burton is a scientist, he desired to obtain scientific evidence of these displays, and a photographer was on hand to do so. A second rook, named Niger, belonged to the Burtons, but let me bring in Burton's own words again. A rook is a moderately large bird with a glossy black plumage. When he ants, this plumage is displayed more fully than at any other time. The effect is magnificent and spectacular. It is, therefore, quite unmistakable. However, Niger refused to ant, with ants, that is. And so the photographer, who was, as a matter of fact, Dr. Burton's daughter, remembering how other birds would ant with embers and matches and burning cigarettes, decided to try something else. She set fire to a small pile of straw. Niger jumped onto the fire, spread his wings, snatched at the flame with his beak. It seemed incredible that a bird could stand among flames with the tongues licking up to its outstretched wings without sustaining injury. Niger became wildly excited, hopping around, snatching at the burning straw with his beak, at the same time bringing his wings forward, and the head constantly in movement, snatching at the smoke, snatching at the flame, and passing the beak up and down inside the wings. Yet there was no sign of singeing, and no smell of burnt feathers. I should imagine that the film which showed this must be one of the most fascinating ever made, and I would rather see it than any Hollywood or underground film ever filmed. Did the film come out when it was sent to be developed? It certainly did, and it showed, in Burton's words, the vigorous flailing of the wings. There was something seemingly miraculous about the performance. The bird would wallow and gyrate over the flames, and saliva formed in its beak. Burton showed the film to the London Zoological Society, and the chairman said, after the showing ended, "Of course, it is the answer to the Phoenix legend." After this, almost anything one could say would be an anticlimax. We do not know why birds behave this way, but we know they do. We do not know who the people were who first saw and spoke of the bird which gathered aromatic plants to make use of them, but we know that they really must have seen this. We cannot say who first observed a bird in a burning nest, fanning the flames with its wings, but we can say that they actually saw such an incredible sight. And if they also saw the same bird in ecstasy falling over or falling down, and the rest of it being hidden from them by smoke, If they thought that the bird had burned to death in the fire, why, one cannot blame them for thinking so. Where did the bird, in ancient times, before the time of matches, obtain the fire? From another fire, it would seem. From any other fire, for any burning ember or piece of wood with one end glowing would do. And if the scene was not seen often, and if indeed it was seen extremely seldom, why then, how natural to believe that such a scene took place only every 500 or 1,000 years. As for the Bennu, the blue heron, which nested in Egypt in the top of the Bennu palm tree, why, it seems possible that anyway the name of phoenix came from that, possibly from a purely homonymous resemblance. As for the other possible connections, well, who knows? What bird was it, then, which, so gorgeous of plumage, gave its physical appearance to the phoenix of legend? Phoenix red and gold and purple and blue and parrots have been suggested, and golden pheasants, and the bird of paradise, and the blossom-headed parakeet of India, and it is useless, it is vain to ask what bird with even merely red and blue and gold plumage might have been the original phoenix, or so I think. I think that surely the name does not come from the bird, but from the blue-gold-red fire the bird began. It was the, so to speak, plumes of fire, which were phoenikos, or glowing red. For after all, the phoenix is, above all, the fire-bird. It is the bird of fire. It is the fire of life.
What'd you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, David Pickering, deserves a tin star for doing all of that without a stumble. I don't know how many retakes there were, but there's a lot of dependent clauses and side trails and everything that I personally love as a reader. But I think if you're reading it out loud, that'd be a job.
Yeah, he is a really special narrator, and I feel so blessed to have found him. And actually, I forgot to mention at the beginning of this, one of the things that I had was David Pickering doing the entire narration of Who Fired the Phoenix. At the end of this podcast, I'm actually going to have Avram's narration, and which we'll talk about in a second,
Right.
of Who Fired the Phoenix. It's unfortunately not complete. It's really cool, though. You get to hear his own voice. And he used to send these to me as a little boy, these lectures, and I used to just sit there and listen to them for hours, all these adventures in Unhistory, which was so much fun. But like I said, it's unfortunate it's not finished. And it wasn't meant, he was preparing for a lecture, so it wasn't really meant as a, let me give this all to you in an exciting way. He was just reading them to check on timing, but it's still amazing nonetheless. But overall, keep going. Any thoughts on the story itself?
I mean, this is, like I said, this is the first time that I remember having read Davidson, was reading Who Fired the Phoenix. And I mean, what hit me when I reread it is the same thing that hit me when I first read it when I was 15, was just, you can do that. You can write like that. I've tried my whole adult career to get to write like that. And it still amazes me that you can go Lactantius and Thomas Brown and ridiculous Irish bird poems and all the different directions that he goes, the sort of the pulling everything back to those three not at all randomly chosen moments in 1934, the big reveal at the end, the sort of the magician's prestige, if you will. It's a masterpiece of structure that doesn't look like structure, which I think is one of the keystones of these adventures. And it's what I really tried to do when I did my own tribute, I guess you could say, homage.
Which I read, by the way. It was great.
My cover band version, if you will, of the adventures in Suppressed Transmission, which is a column I wrote for about a decade, that was literally just me trying to capture that first flame that I grasped in 1981 when I was 15. And it's such a, I mean, the word is overused maybe, but such a bravura performance, while still not being about the flashiness of the language. The language is just always perfect. It just always says what it means to say, heads in the direction it means to go. It seems like it's just random, but of course it isn't. It's just a magnificent way to sort of introduce someone to a writer, is to see that, and to writing as a concept. At 15, I was aware of style, but the knowledge that you could do that with nonfiction. I mean, I'd read the L. Sprague de Camp book that he quotes in it. Elsewhere in the Sinbad, I think he talks about L. Sprague, but I'd read other sorts of books like that, but this was a revelation to me. And then rereading it again, you're just so impressed at the way that he almost, you know, it's like a cross hatching in an illustration. There's just the little lines keep going, and for a while you're like, what is this? And it's suddenly, oh, I get it. The image reveals itself. It's such a piece of work. I mean, literally in every sense of that phrase, I guess.
And you had a chance to listen to Avram's as well,
Yeah.
reading it, correct?
Mhm.
Any thoughts on Avram reading it, what that was like?
I mean, part of it was just sort of a frisson of joy that I got to hear this writer who I've admired for, you know, the better part of 4 decades. And it's just, I mean, you had the opportunity to hear him all the time, so I'm sure maybe that's a little old hat to you, but I never got to see him at a convention or hear him speak in anything else, any other. So the first time to hear his voice, and it's exactly like I said at the upshot. It's very much, I'm going to tell you a story. As long as you're buying, here's how it's going to go. That sort of approachable tone. He's, I think, being a little more lectury in the recording that you gave us, but it still comes through that that warmth and this is so cool, I have to show it to you character. It's just, and it sounded basically just like the Avram Davidson I'd made up in my head. So that was wonderful. But it was just a joy to get to hear him read it.
So what's remarkable about it is I knew I'd listened to these stories when I was a little boy. I remembered listening to them.
Right.
But I couldn't find them. So it took me almost 3 years before I finally found copies of them.
Right.
So I started questioning, did I imagine listening to all these? Maybe he read them to me, but I knew. You start questioning.
Right. And it's not like they were easy to find either. The Adventures in Unhistory are, you know, a fairly recondite crowd.
Yeah, anyways, I'm glad that they're in existence. There's several. I don't know if any of them are complete, but they all give a flavor of him. And I don't know, it's kind of scary, but as AI improves, I imagine maybe down the road we could have him actually narrate the entire Unhistory in the right way, which is a little scary.
Yeah,
but
I don't know about that.
Likely.
I feel like you don't want to put the David Pickerings of the world out of work.
I know. Well, that's the downside. I agree. But it's nice when you can capture the actual author who's passed. Like, you're not gonna be able to do that with someone from 300 years ago.
Right.
But the fact that you can actually capture the actual voice of the person, that's kind of unique.
Yeah. And having the raw recordings is so amazing that, you know, I don't even know if it's necessary to add serial fillers to it. It's so magnificent.
I agree. I mean, that is what part of what makes it so amazing, and that he wasn't really preparing these for an audible narration,
right?
As opposed to David, who was. So one of the things I always love to do on these episodes is talk about, if we were to make a film or a TV series, how we would treat it. I've had a lot of fun with this, and one of these days I hope something happens. But with Adventures in Unhistory, it's sort of unique. Yeah. And I was curious, I know I let you know I'd be asking this question. Did you have a chance to think about if you were going to make this into a series or a film, how would you treat it? What would you do?
I mean, not to keep coming back to things I loved when I was 15, but there was a TV show on, I think, BBC, one of the British channels. It was on PBS in America, called Connections by James Burke. And
Okay.
James Burke would begin with like a billiard ball and the space shuttle and the path of a bumblebee's flight or whatever. And he would take these and sort of draw them together, and suddenly we're learning about gravity, right? And his notion was how these historically contingent moments turned into something that is present in our world now. And it was just a lightning bolt. It made Cosmos look tired to me when I was a kid, because it was all about these contingencies and misturnings in history, and I really feel like that structure would be perfect for the adventures. That you don't begin by saying we're going to talk about the Phoenix. You begin with the three little episodes that he teases at the beginning. You begin with Lactantius. You do this. You show medieval engravings, and you go to Yemen and look at the frankincense trees, and you show pictures of a golden pheasant and a purple heron and all the other stuff, and Phoenix, Arizona, for all I know. And then at the end, big reveal, that's the Phoenix. And I feel like the way that the pieces are structured, that's the way to present it, as opposed to just sort of taking all the beautiful facts and speculations out and lining them up in order like you're just doing a National Geographic special on the Phoenix. That literally, that murders to dissect, like Wordsworth says. It's just that you owe it to the material to do something wild and seemingly acausal, where the viewer is piecing together the connections with you in the way that James Burke did on his show. And that would be if Netflix comes to me, hey Netflix, and says, make the Adventures in Unhistory television show. That's how I'd do it.
So I'll tell you, when I initially, the first episode of Unhistory that we did, we came up with an idea of, I think it was Ian McClellan and Patrick Stewart grabbing ice cream and kind of checking out these different myths.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me, I think I know exactly where I'd want to take this if Netflix were to come to me, which would be, Neil Gaiman.
Yeah.
He's a big Davidson fan.
Mm-hmm.
He has a presence about him that's pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, Neil Gaiman chasing Unhistory.
Yeah.
It would actually be Neil Gaiman going to meet with these different interesting people, going and chase it, almost exactly in the way that you describe it, but your host would be Neil Gaiman.
Yeah, I mean,
all these interesting.
I think James Burke is no longer with us, sadly, but Neil Gaiman as James Burke in Unhistory Connections would be a great show. I'd watch it, certainly.
I can't think of anyone else who'd be he would be the perfect host. He has enough gravitas, enough fans. I think it'd be.
And he shares that sort of obtrusive, well-read quality that the Clute talks about. I think maybe Stephen Fry is the only other person that I might, tap for that. Is that he's got that same, he's nothing against Neil, but Fry is very affable in the same sort of way that I feel like Davidson is.
Right.
And so, if you can't get Neil, see if Stephen Fry's busy that day, is what I'd
Fair
say.
enough.
Yeah.
I'll work on it. I'll have my
yeah.
people talk to his people.
Fantastic. And then I just want the standard 10%, nothing fancy for me.
So before we go, anything else you'd like to add or say, or what you're up to? Any more thoughts on Davidson?
I guess I can say that to the extent that my whole career has been a tribute to Avram Davidson, you can certainly pick up every now and again. We go a little Davidsonian. We certainly try our versions of Unhistory on my podcast. Ken and Robin talk about stuff. There's usually a segment on the Elliptony Hut where we look at weird stuff. So to the extent that we're, I'm still trying to capture that fire, followed in the footsteps of the master. That's where I'm doing it mostly. And then, just hit me up on Twitter. That's where you and I met after all. So at Kenneth Hite on Twitter. Yeah. Yeah.
Please continue. Anything that you think I should post, especially as it relates to Avram, let me know. I think it's an episode that his fans would particularly enjoy. Make sure to let me know, and let's definitely stay in touch.
Absolutely. This is
I
so
feel
great
like
to get to do this.
I've become a big fan. I don't know if you ever listened to Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like you and I are going to be friends.
I feel like we're already friends, quite frankly, Seth. I'm a little insulted that you feel like it's in the future.
Well, we're going to be hanging out is what I mean.
That's what we can do. Exactly. Get to Chicago, man.
I actually will be driving through coming up in August. So I'll let you know.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll be out of town at the first part of the month, but I think the rest of the month I'm there.
Let's
do it.
Hey, Ken, real pleasure.
Real pleasure, Seth. Thanks so much for bringing me on.
Thank you.
Once again, we take up the tape cassette in order to time the first version of this adventure in Unhistory entitled The Phoenix. The place is El Paso, Texas. The date, November 20th, 1979. The year is 1934, and of a decade which began in the Great Depression and ended in the Second World War, it may be said that no year was a good year. However, let us take our scientifictional time and space scanner and, peeping backward, zoom in briefly on a few randomly sampled items. Item: a theologian in Rome studies St. Cyril on men's unbelief. Item: a schoolboy in Australia observes a bird doing something odd with ants. Item: a newspaper reporter in England is reproved for bringing in a silly story. Have these three items any connection? Not for that year alone, and not even for that decade, but for any year and any decade? It is almost certainly true that anything in this psychomaterial universe is connected with any other thing in this psychomaterial universe. Therefore, what are the connections which link these three items? Where shall we begin? Once again, I quote Charles Fort, that intensely normal-looking man who spent 40 years collecting reports on the abnormal, and he said, "One measures a circle, beginning anywhere." He might have added, though in doing so, one must avoid circular reasoning. And speaking of which, how is this for a lovely example of circular reasoning? Statement: my guru speaks with the ascended masters. Question: how do you know? Reply: he told me. Question: how do you know he isn't lying? Reply: would the ascended masters speak with a liar? Well, maybe they would. How should I know? What I should know, however, is what has all this to do with the Phoenix? And before even beginning to try to answer that very pertinent question, let us not forget the advice of Socrates. Define your terms. Let us begin then by asking, what is the Phoenix? I have had some personal and slightly painful experience in not taking for granted that everyone knows at least something in the way of an answer, even if only the byword, to rise from one's ashes, like the Phoenix, for example. Some years ago, I wrote a novel entitled The Phoenix in the Mirror, which was described by one critic as Baroque fantasy. Some few years later, I spoke with a young woman who had recently read it. Our conversation, it soon became clear, contained some elements of confusion, and soon later, as we continued to converse, it became even clearer that she had never heard of the legend of the Phoenix, not even via the byword. No, she thought that I had made it all up. She flattered me. I hadn't. Anyway, I hadn't made it all up. The book was writ by magic, but the book and its magic are not the subject of this lecture. Let us begin then by reading one of the versions of this very old legend, that of Lactantius. Sometimes Lactantius is called the Christian Cicero, a comparison which probably pleased Lactantius more than it might Cicero. And sometimes it is said that Lactantius never even wrote the poem, from which my very brief abstract is taken. And if so, as to who did write it, why, I have no idea. I didn't. There is a happy spot retired in the first east, where is the grove of the sun, and stands there planted with many a tree. There is a fountain in the middle, clear, gentle, and abounding with sweet waters. This grove, these woods, a single bird, the phoenix, inhabits. Single, but it lives reproduced by its own death. It obeys Phoebus, son of Apollo, the sun god. And when the phoenix has accomplished the 1,000 years of her life, and the length of her days have become burdensome, in order that she may renew the age which has glided by, full of years she directs her swift flight into Syria, to which Venus herself has given the name of Phoenicia. And through trackless deserts she seeks the retired groves, where a remote wood lies concealed in the glens. There she chooses a lofty palm, which derives the name of Phoenix from the bird, and where no hurtful living creature can break through, or slimy serpent, or any bird of prey. She builds for herself a nest, or a tomb, for she dies that she might live. Rich wood she heaps together, cinnamon and balsam, cassia and the fragrant acanthus, rich drops of the tearful frankincense, tender ears of spikenard, and the pleasing myrrh. Then, amidst such various odors, she yields up her life, nor fears the faith of so great a deposit. But her body, though destroyed by death, is hot, and the heat produces a flame. It conceives fire, it blazes, and is dissolved into burnt ashes. And from these ashes comes a worm, and this increases vastly into an egg, from which the phoenix, having burst its shell, shoots forth, even as a caterpillar is wont to be changed into a butterfly. Her color is like the brilliancy of the red pomegranate when ripe, such color as the red poppy produces in the fields beneath the redly blushing sky. O bird of happy lot and fate, born from herself, happy she who enters into no compact with Venus, goddess of love and matrimony. Death is Venus to her. Her only pleasure is in death, so that she may be born, she desires first to die. She is an offspring to herself, her own father and heir, her own heir, and always a foster child to herself. She is herself indeed, but not the same, since she is herself and not herself, having gained eternal life by the blessing of death. Quite a paradox. Well, not without beauty either of description or concept. A fable. Even fables mean something. What does this one mean? Leaving aside mythology, can we submit this to a process of absolute rationalization and come up with something? Something sensible, that is, in which we can believe? Try this. Long ago, someone saw a bird fly into a nest. Unknown to him, also in the nest was an egg about to hatch. Suddenly the bird dies, the nest bursts into flame, the heat of the fire hatches the egg, and... not very satisfying, is it? Why does the bird suddenly die? Natural causes? Oh, very well, the bird suddenly dies of natural causes. Happens all the time. Yes, but how does the nest suddenly burst into flames? What? Spontaneous combustion? Well, I suppose. And since I am supposing, I suppose I might as well suppose that the heat of the fire lasted just long enough to hatch the already to hatch egg and then went out by natural causes. But what? The newly hatched hatchling couldn't have had any feathers? let alone those as red as the pomegranate and the poppy? Newly hatched birds have no feathers? Oh, very well then. If you were going to spoil my nice rationalization with such comments, I will have to admit that part of it couldn't be true. The passerby must have made it up. It is strange how reluctant we are to allow ancient and or distant peoples with imagination enough to simply make up a story. We make them all the time, and often they don't mean a thing. Not a thing. But perhaps you are unwilling to admit this. Everything means something. The subconscious mind, for example, well, since we have brought the subconscious mind in, since we have failed to rationalize this story, let us proceed to psychoanalyze this story. It is an erection fantasy. It is an archetypal account of copulation and birth. Not rebirth, just birth. We know that die is a colloquial word for orgasm, and we have read Jorge Luis Borges' story, The Sect of the Phoenix, in which immortal life was granted to the members of the sect by virtue of their performing a somewhat squalid act, and to the performance of which they may be initiated even by children or servants. And we may even know that Borges himself has said that the secret of the sect of the Phoenix is merely copulation. What more do we need? We need, for one thing, a further examination of this legend, because, for another thing, this lecture has to last an hour, and an hour might be barely long enough to examine a legend which has from ancient times taken such a hold upon the minds of mankind. Unlike such legends as those of the werewolf or even of the mandrake, this one, that of the phoenix, seems at least to be and to have been completely harmless. But it may be nonetheless fascinating. It might lead us somewhere. It might lead us nowhere. Let us at least see. Let us, for example, see what the theologian in Rome saw when he read the writings of St. Cyril, when he was reading it in Rome in the year 1934. St. Cyril wrote, long before that year, God knew men's unbelief, and therefore provided this bird as evidence of the resurrection. You see that no less an authority than one of the fathers of the church, far from dismissing it as a pagan fantasy, accepted the phoenix as an actuality, as had many others in authority done, both before and after Cyril. There were, of course, skeptics. For example, here is Herodotus, a most learned and well-traveled native of Asia Minor and of Greek descent, called, in case you didn't know, called the father of history. Had he, in his travels, learned about it? He had visited Egypt, and in particular Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and wrote some comment on the Egyptian veneration of the goose. Yes, the goose. You and I might not, I think, care to venerate the goose, but we might, and then again we might not, prefer it to venerating some other of the creatures of which the ancient Egyptians were so fond, say, the crocodile. It might certainly be safer, for one thing. And then the father of history goes on to say, there is another sacred bird named the phoenix. I have never seen it myself except in pictures, for it is exceedingly rare, only appearing, according to the people of Heliopolis, once in 500 years, when it is seen after the death of its parent. If the pictures are accurate, its size and appearance are as follows. Its plumage is partly red and partly gold, while in shape and size it is very much like an eagle. They tell a story about this bird. The phoenix is said to come from Arabia, carrying the parent bird encased in myrrh. It proceeds to the temple of the sun, and there buries the body. In order to do this, they say that it first forms a ball as big as it can carry. Then, hollowing out the ball, it inserts its dead parent, subsequently covering over the opening with fresh myrrh. The ball is then exactly the same weight as it was at first. The phoenix bears this ball to Egypt, all encased as I have said, and deposits it in the temple of the sun. Such is their myth about this bird. I have left out a few words. I shall now tell them to you. Herodotus says, "Personally, I find it incredible." And well he might. He, however, leaves something out. Did you notice? Nothing said here about the phoenix being burned to ashes and then being reborn out of them. Well, Herodotus didn't have to tell us everything he saw and heard. After all, how much were they paying him? Now I would point a few things out to you. For one thing, note that the funeral of the dead phoenix took place at the temple of the sun. Note, too, the mention of it being encased in a ball. We all know that among the many, many creatures venerated by the Egyptians was the scarab, a large beetle, and the scarab is shown time after time rolling the sun like a ball across the sky, which is why it was sacred. But what so many of our books failed to point out is that the scarab is, in entomology as distinct from mythology, the scarab is a dung beetle. And I can tell you, for I have seen it myself, not in Egypt, but in the Holy Land right next to Egypt, I can tell you that what the scarabs roll across the earth are balls of dung. They form the balls. I saw them do it out of camel dung near the ruins of the ancient Philistine city of Ascalon. And then they get right up on their hind legs and they roll it. They keep on rolling it along. And why do they do this? No myth or secret to it. The scarabs don't care who knows. They roll it to a place of their choice, and then they lay their eggs in it. And the warmth of the decomposing substance helps the baby scarabs to hatch. So it seems to me that the ancient Egyptians seem to have given the phoenix some of the characteristics of the scarab. And if we had never seen any scarabs ourselves, we might well say that they were mythical, and that personally we found the whole story incredible, as in part, the part about rolling the sun, it is. They also seem to have tidied up the tail a bit. Myrrh, for example, is ever so much nicer than manure. Well, with the phoenix only appearing in Egypt every 500 years, the people had lots of time to think about it and to think of improvements. As it happened, 500 years after Herodotus, and on the other side of the Mediterranean, lived the Roman poet Ovid. His common name, by the way, was Naso, meaning nose. And although he inherited the name, he may have earned it as well, because sundry ancient writers have told us that on one all but fatal occasion he was very nosy indeed, and evidently may have walked in on the Emperor Augustus without knocking. Exactly what Ovid saw upon that memorable scene is a matter for conjecture. He never said. Augustus, shall we call him Gus? No? Very well. Augustus never said either. But the difference between these two close-mouthed ancient Romans is that Ovid was a poet and Augustus was an emperor. And so guess which one had the most clout? Ovid was banished, exiled, all the way to the Black Sea, and there, after bitching and moaning and writing plaintive, poetic pleas, there he died, but not before having written the following lines. All these receive their birth from other things, but from himself the phoenix only springs, self-born, begotten by the parent flame, in which he burned another and the same. So if the element, the poetic element, of fire, wasn't there in the legend in the time of Herodotus, it certainly was there by the time of Ovid. And it is this part of the legend which has endured. People tended to forget about the big ball of wax, myrrh. They tended to forget the filial piety of the blessed bird and bringing his father all the way to Egypt for a big funeral at the temple of the sun. What people tended to remember was that the phoenix built a sort of special nest, somehow caused it to catch on fire, was burned to ashes, and out of the ashes was somehow born anew. It is, after all, a metaphor of supreme vividness and strength, and it was added to yet another element. That is, that not only did the phoenix, which by now was not seen as being dead when its nest caught fire, but as being alive, that not only did the phoenix somehow cause the fire, that is, somehow start the fire, the phoenix was thought of and depicted as fanning the fire, upon which fire it was consumed, only to rise again. So one is not altogether surprised to read in one medieval bestiary, a bestiary being a book of beasts, with each creature being described not exclusively in terms of natural science, but in terms of metaphor and allegory as well, of religion, that is. One is not altogether surprised to read the following passage. The phoenix, no, this is its lot. It comes to death of its own free will, and from death it comes to life. Hear what he signifies. Phoenix signifies Jesus, son of Mary, that he had the power to die of his own free will, and from death came to life. And yet, about 2,000 years after Herodotus, that wise man of Norfolk, England, not Virginia, Sir Thomas Browne, M.D., did find it necessary to include these lines in his book, Vulgar Errors of the Day. That there is but one phoenix in the world, which after many hundred years burneth itself, and from the ashes rises up another, is a conceit not new or altogether popular, but of great antiquity, not only delivered by humane authors, but frequently expressed by holy writers, by Cyril, Epiphanius, and others, all which, notwithstanding, we cannot presume the existence of this animal, nor dare we affirm that there is any phoenix in nature. For, first, there wants herein the definite tests of things uncertain, that is, the sense of man. For though many writers have much enlarged hereon, there is not any ocular describer, or such as presumeth to confirm it upon aspection. Primitive authors, from whom the stream of relations is derivative, deliver themselves dubiously, and either by a doubtful parenthesis or a timorous conclusion, overthrow the whole relation. As for its unity, or conceit that there should be but one in nature, it seemeth not only repugnant unto philosophy, but also Holy Scripture, which plainly affirms there went of every sort at least two into the ark of Noah, every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort, they went into the ark, and two of all flesh wherein there is breath of life. It infringeth the benediction of God concerning multiplication. God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and let fowls multiply in the earth. Which terms are not applicable unto the phoenix, whereof there is but one in the world, and no more living than at the first benediction. As for longevity, that it liveth 1,000 years or more, besides that from imperfect observations and rarity of appearances no confirmation can be made, there may probably be a mistake in the compute. For the tradition being very ancient, the conceit might have its original in times of shorter compute. For if we suppose our present calculations, the phoenix now in nature will be the 6th from the creation, and but in the middle of its years. And if the Rabbine's prophecy succeed, it shall conclude its days not in its own, but in the last and general flames. A consoling thought. Now, as this may be generally considered a Protestant view, and as we have already heard what might be generally considered a Catholic view, are there any Muslim and Jewish views? Indeed, there are. The 1962 Encyclopedia Britannica tells us, among the Arabs, the story of the phoenix was confused with that of the salamander, and the samand or samandal, from whose feathers a fireproof cloth is woven. The salamander, of course, being able to live in fires and not minding in the least being regarded as the source of asbestos. The samand or samandal is represented sometimes as a quadruped, sometimes as a bird. As for the rabbis, or as Sir Thomas calls them, the rabbins, they felt that while of course everything in the Bible is true, not everything that is true is in the Bible. Obviously, there would not be enough room. And in fact, they were much exercised. How was there enough room in the ark? What, for example, about Leviathan, which is, after all, mentioned only in the singular, as though there were only one? It was ancient rabbinical opinion that the Leviathans, plural, merely stuck their chins up on the deck of the ark, so to speak, for support, and paddled the rest of them astern. One, however, rather like Lot's wife, made the mistake of looking back, or something like that, and so was drowned. Since when there was only one Leviathan, like one phoenix? And what of the elephant? It was well known in old rabbinical circles that, to save room, Noah took a pregnant elephant. As to how he knew that she was, so to speak, with elephant of the male sex, well, perhaps that should be of interest only to another elephant. But in regard to the phoenix, Maurice Burton, a British natural historian upon whose book Phoenix Reborn this lecture depends almost, if not quite, in its entirety, for reasons you will get to see, Burton says, the rabbins tell us that all the birds save the phoenix shared in the sin of Eve and ate of the forbidden fruit. As a reward, the phoenix was given not immortality, but this modified form of immutability. Now to go back a bit, as for the phoenix fanning the fires of its own funeral pyre, with what did the phoenix fan them? Legend, assisted by art, shows the bird using nothing else but its own wings to fan the flames. And this was easy to assimilate, even without thinking about it, for the fires of the old domestic hearth were commonly fanned with a bird's wing. Not probably the wing of the bird just then cooking in the pot over the fire, but likelier the wing of some inedible bird, some varmint bird, say a hawk. The hawk is, after all, a small eagle, and the eagle a large hawk. Both are raptorials, or accipiters, and Herodotus saw a picture in which the phoenix looked like an eagle. So it all fit in. Legend, we see, supported the fable of the phoenix. So did poetry. So did, anyway, the old-time religion, although the new-time religion and the new-time science was doubtful. The French naturalist Cuvier, early on in the 19th century, suggested that the phoenix was actually a pheasant, precisely the golden pheasant. Certainly in ancient times the golden pheasant was not known outside of China, and its plumage in a way resembles that attributed to the phoenix. But if it was not known outside of China, how could it have become the subject of a legend most widely known in the Near or Middle East and the Mediterranean? Cuvier suggests that, well, somehow one might have, so to speak, mistaken its way. It is a long way to mistake, but there is nothing absolutely impossible in the suggestion. However, how often could this have happened? Cuvier seizes on this very point. It could not have happened often, he argued. Hence the belief that the phoenix appeared only every 500, at the minimal calculation, years. I find this somewhat circular reasoning, personally. Still, let us for the argument agree that in the appearance of the golden pheasant lies the origin of the description of the phoenix. But how about the rest of it? There is, to be sure, a Chinese legend of a phoenix, but the comparison with our legend of the phoenix vanishes while you examine it. I know because I once briefly lived in China, and it vanished while I was examining it. The fact is, alas, that early or rather later European visitors in China, observing that the Chinese had a legend of a marvelous red bird too, in effect cried, "The phoenix!" The Chinese used to be very polite to foreigners, when indeed they were not cutting them into very small pieces, and so very politely they decided that this was indeed the proper foreign word for their own legendary birdie. But that is about that. T.H. White, better known for his The Once and Future King, translated the bestiary, and in his own commentary on the phoenix, says very calmly and casually, it was probably the purple heron. He was, in his turn, very probably repeating the suggestions made by other and earlier writers on the subject of this fantastic bird, the phoenix, which made itself a nest of spicy and pungent and aromatic plants, and then, fire somehow being introduced into this nest, fanned the fire with its wings and perished in an ecstasy, only to rise from its ashes reborn. Suggestions which suggested that the bird in question was indeed a heron. What is the connection? Here is one. The heron was known to make its nest in the tops of palm trees. So was the phoenix. Adventures in Unhistory lectures with the aid of our tape cassette. It's the day after Thanksgiving Day, 1979. In fact, and we should make note of this, in at least one language, the word for palm tree is the same as the word for phoenix. Remember that Lactantius says that the tree derives its name from the bird, but may it not be the other way around? Palm trees, after all, are common in hot countries, and even in those merely warm, whereas one thing which all writers insisted on about the phoenix is that it was not only uncommon, it was exceedingly rare. It does seem likelier that the rara avis took its name from an unrare tree rather than vice versa. Shakespeare, in his poem The Phoenix and the Turtle, refers to the bird of loudest lay, a song that is, as in the Lay of the Last Minstrel. Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, and so on. It is not meant to imply that there was only one tree in Arabia, but that, I think, the tree of the phoenix was unique, as was the bird. As to why the bird of loudest lay or song, well, it was another part of the legend that the phoenix, as it died, sang a song of exceeding sweetness, and I suppose it must have sung loudly as well as sweetly, because as it proceeded from Arabia, or Phoenicia, which is adjacent, into Egypt, it was accompanied by flocks of other birds, perhaps alerted by the song, as well as the red and gold glory of the bird's plumage. Now, it may not have escaped attention that there is at least some resemblance between the words Phoenix and Phoenicia. The matter is complicated, and I shall proceed to complicate it still more. The Phoenicians did not call themselves Phoenicians, but many people are commonly called by names other than their original names for themselves. The Hungarians call themselves Magyar. The American Indians, for example, never thought of calling themselves Indians, and nowadays many of them prefer to call themselves Native Americans, as though the rest of us were all born somewhere else, and for that matter, as though the word American were a Native American word, which it is, after all, not. However, the ancient Greeks it was who called the coastal people of what is now Lebanon and Syria by the name of Phoenicians. It means the red ones, so to speak, from the Greek phoinos or poinos. Remember the Punic Wars? They were the wars between Rome and Carthage, a Phoenician colonially founded city in North Africa. And we are usually informed that this name of red ones was given because the Phoenicians were sunburned by their long voyages at sea, which they made to bring the Greeks not only the alphabet, but such trade items as glassware and copper, which is, by the way, red, and the famous Phoenician Tyrian dye, which is almost invariably referred to as purple dye. And as a matter of fact, its colors ranged quite a way along the spectrum and included blue and red. And red. The phoenix was also red, but the purple heron was, well, purple. I myself have never seen a purple heron, never hoped to, no, well, but I have in Sausalito, California, seen a blue heron, several ones. They are sort of blue-gray, and some authorities are insisted that it is a mistake to connect the blue heron with the purple heron with ancient Egyptian bird worship. It was the gray heron, they say. However, there is no gray phoenix. I have quoted T.H. White in the Book of Beasts. Now let me quote Richard Carrington in his book, Mermaids and Mastodons. He begins by quoting our old and so well-read friend Pliny the Elder, who said that the body of the phoenix was a deep red purple, and that on its head it had a tuft and plume. Carrington points out that the purple heron does anyway have a plume on its head, indeed, and that it was one of the symbols of the sun god at Heliopolis, which, remember, was the very place whither the phoenix brought, in one version, the body of its father for burial. T.H. White seemed to see no further problem, and even Carrington glides away from the subject. But there is one obvious and even matter-of-fact objection, and that is that the heron, far from being seen only once in 1,000 years or even 500 years, is seen all the time. Something seems to have been lost in translation, but I am not yet ready to leave Carrington. In prehistoric times, he says, when men sought gods in the forces of nature, a bird deity was the obvious choice to symbolize the sky, for birds were the only creatures who naturally belonged to that element. One had not to be a theologian in order to take the tempting trail to either symbolism or allegory, which are, after all, brother and sister, in an attempt to, so to speak, lift the veil of Isis. In other words, decide what these ancient stories really meant. And the most popular method was to declare any one of them a nature myth. And of these, the most popular was to say that something, anything, was a solar myth. Applying this to the phoenix, let us admit at once, or anyway almost at once, that the phoenix lends itself really very easily to definition as a solar myth. It is red and yellow, it does die, and it is reborn, just like the sun. But to go back to the myth of the scarab, which none of these writers whom I have quoted seems to have done, the Egyptian myth of the scarab which rolled the great globe or ball of the sun across the sky, this is not as glamorous as the Greek myth, which has Apollo driving the sun as a chariot across the sky. How natural to assume, as many of the ancients did assume, that it was from the iron shoes that shod the chariot horses of the sun that there came sparks, and that it was these which ignited the funeral pyre of the phoenix. It seems somehow to make sense, almost, until we pause and realize that, after all, there are no horses up there in the sky. There are no stones up there in the sky either. Hence, of course, stones cannot fall from up there down to here, to earth. Hence, the wise men of former times were quite right to deny the existence of meteorites, and they did deny them. And they did deny it, and went right on denying it well into the 19th century. Thomas Jefferson denied it, and when a couple of members of the Harvard faculty announced all the evidence, Jefferson said, I would rather believe that two Yankee professors have lied than believe that that stones fall from the sky. He was a great man, but he was wrong. And perhaps if you think that what I mean to imply is that it was meteorites, shooting or falling stars, which ignited the nest of the phoenix, well, perhaps you too may be wrong. And when we consider the melody of the dying phoenix, this inevitably brings to mind the legend of the dying swan and its swan song. And of course it was also said that swans it was that drew, sometimes, the chariot of the sun, and not horses. After all, a singing horse would be a bit much. However, I am not yet finished really with the scarab. The typewriter made a mistake right at this point and wrote for scarab, akrabs. And akrab is the Hebrew and perhaps the Arabic word for scorpion. I intend to do nothing whatsoever about this. I shall return, as I said I would, to the scarab, the insect of the sun. Insects lay eggs, and the eggs turn into caterpillars or grubs or maggots or, well, worms. And in the case of the phoenix, the process was reversed. The worm turned, indeed. It turned into an egg, and the egg into another phoenix. If we knew nothing of birds, would we believe that they produced eggs? If we knew nothing of eggs, would we believe that they produced birds? Down to the age of Shakespeare, a certain European goose was never known to produce an egg. Its goslings were never seen by man, and the universal explanation was that it hatched at sea from a certain mollusk. At least I hope it is a mollusk, hence its name of barnacle goose. Evidently the young barnacle looked vaguely enough anserine, goose-like, to support such a story. Not until very late in the 16th or very early in the 17th century was the immense and frozen archipelago called Spitsbergen or Svalbard discovered or rediscovered. Men went there for whales, and they found the whales, but they also found something else, something seen more or less for the first time by the eyes of man, namely the perfectly normal nests and eggs of the so-called barnacle goose, there above the Arctic Circle. The argument ab silentio, on which this almost nursery rhyme had been based, was destroyed by the squawking of, may I say it, Mother Goose. But no voyage to what were then called the East Greenland seas destroyed in the slightest the mysterious veil, and perhaps it was the veil of Isis, which hung in tantalizing, gauzy drapes all round about the fable of the phoenix. The sign of the phoenix appeared in the elaboratorial manuscripts of the alchemists and hung over the doors of the apothecaries. The 17th century gave way to the 18th, and the 18th to the 19th. The sign of the phoenix was employed even by, of all antic notions, by fire insurance companies. But the mystery of the phoenix remained unsolved. John James Audubon. Everybody knows the name of Audubon. Not everybody knows, however, that he once planned to go into the steamboat business on the Ohio River with a young English immigrant named Keats, a brother, as a matter of fact, of the poet Keats. The steamboats, however, so to speak, never got off the ground. Audubon probably lost his money. Keats in America certainly lost his money, and Keats in England wrote to him, "I am afraid that Mr. Audubon is not a very honest man." Another and a later poet wrote, "Keats had TB, Shelley drowned, Shakespeare lies in the cold, cold ground." Audubon, meanwhile, not much knowing what else to do, began to paint birds. Before long he had enough for a book, but before long, too, He realized that there weren't enough customers for it in America. He went to England. We may suppose he did not bother to call upon the Keats family for a subscription. He went to Scotland. In Edinburgh, he called on, among other people, a prominent local surgeon. I quote from memory. He came to me directly from his dissecting room, with the blood still wet upon his hands. His manner was most gentlemanly and agreeable, and he promised to help me in my endeavors as most he could. The surgeon I will now reveal to you was a Dr. Knox. In fact, he was the Dr. Knox, and the source of the bodies in the dissecting room, whose blood was still wet upon his hands, will not bear examination, so let us examine it. As bodies were essential to the study of medicine and surgery, and as the only bodies available for the purpose were those of criminals who had been hanged, a supply which had begun to dry up anyway, a professional corps, shall we say, had grown up of grave robbers. They sold their robbed bodies to the medical profession, and they were known not as Dickens's Jerry Cruncher preferred to be known as, to wit, agricultural character, but as resurrection men, shades of the phoenix. Eh? Times had been very hard in Ireland, and God knows they must have been very hard for people to migrate thence to Scotland. We well know that most Irish people are the salt of the earth, descendants of kings and princes, pious, jovial, and learned. However, two of them were not any of these things. One was named Burke, and one was named Hare, and in order to make the rent on their, shall we say, studio apartment, called in the pawky Scots dialect a butt and ben, and located in Tanner's Close, I regret to say that they proceeded to murder the many guests who found hospitality with them, and whose delectable corpses they sold to, but surely you know the verse, I wants to make your flesh creep. I'll recite it to you. Up the close and down the stair, Butt and Ben wi' Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, and Knox the boy who buys the beef. From Keats at one end to Burke and Hare at the other, Audubon was certainly connected with a lot of very interesting people, one way or another. And taking another way, let us consider what else he had been doing. He had been watching wild turkeys and what they had been doing. This was in the good old USA, in one of the eastern states, perhaps Kentucky. I quote Maurice Burton, from whose book Phoenix Reborn I have quoted before. He says that Audubon spoke of the turkeys rolling themselves in deserted ants' nests, and then he quotes Audubon for the reason: to clear their growing feathers of the loose scales and prevent ticks and other vermin from attacking them, these insects being unable to bear the odor of the earth in which ants have dwelt. Well, this is interesting. This is very interesting because, do you remember, one of the random samples which we took of the year in 1934 showed a schoolboy in Australia doing something odd with ants. However, a slight aside. About 20 years ago, I attended a science fiction convention in the city of Detroit in a hotel large enough to have holden two other conventions going on at the same time. One was the Chevrolet Salesmen of Southern Michigan, a group which was merely totally bewildered by the presence of so many people who read what was still widely known as that crazy Buck Rogers stuff. The other gathering was that of the Plymouth Brethren, a rather obscure religious denomination, which paid us no attention whatsoever and spent most of their time behind the closed rooms of their conventicle pro tem, singing somewhat lugubrious hymns. A friend of mine subsequently observed a couple of them when church, so to speak, let out, and the couple of them were engaged in, well, hoisting a couple. "Isn't drinking against your religion?" he inquired. One of them looked at him with some degree of pity and quoted the text, "The Son of Man cameth eating and drinking, and they calleth him a glutton and a wine-bibber." The other one said, "Spirits are the good gift of the Lord, and the saints should partake of them freely." I wish that my liver still allowed me to say, "I'll drink to that." 150 years ago, the perhaps outstanding member of this sect was Mr. Philip Henry Goss, the naturalist and author. It was his bad luck to be at the height of his fame and his powers when overtaken by the discoveries of fossils believed to be millions of years old. And when asked by the Reverend Charles Kingsley, author of Westward Ho and The Water Babies, how he, Goss, reconciled the existence of these fossils with the belief that the Earth was less than 5,000 years old, he, Goss, replied that they had been planted at the time of creation to test our faith. Kingsley's reply was, "I cannot believe that the Almighty has written into the rocks an immense lie." This, however, lay a bit in the future of the year 1847, when Goss published the book Birds of Jamaica. One of these birds is the Barbados blackbird, also called the tinkling grackle, although I think that only the English could come up with a name like the tinkling grackle. Yet be that as it may, Goss described how the birds would often go and gather limes, bruised by falling off trees, then stand on one foot and rub the oozing fruit under the opposite wing, then switch to the other leg and apply the lime beneath the wing on the other side. Was the blackbird, or if you insist, the tinkling grackle, was the bird by any other name concerned with possible under-wing odor? Burton says this bathing might go on for an hour, and was presumed to have as its aim the application of the aromatic juice of the lime to the feathers. Odd. 30 years later came a report that a tame crow was seen deliberately to take its stand on an anthill and allow the ants to crawl over its plumage, seizing parasites in their jaws and bear them away. This sounds a little like the accounts of the small birds which are allowed to roam freely upon the crocodile in order to pick decaying flesh from its teeth. Burton says, referring to the bird accounts, during the next 60 years there were a number of similar stories published in a variety of journals, scientific and otherwise, but no self-respecting ornithologist believed them. They were, in fact, treated like the myth of the phoenix, as wholly fictitious. The year is now 1834. Peter Bradley, an Australian schoolboy, writes to a Melbourne newspaper to say that he had noticed starlings picking up ants and stowing them away among their feathers. And this letter is read by A.H. Chisholm, who is working on a book called Bird Wonders of Australia. Chisholm does not altogether believe the story, but, Pete being persistent, Chisholm is impressed enough to add a note about it to his book. I now switch from a historical present to the past. The note was read by Professor Erwin Strassman in Europe, who published it in a monthly magazine about birds. Letters poured in, not just from schoolboys either, and in a short time the practice was acknowledged not only to exist, but to exist in many different kinds of birds. It was named anting. It still is called anting, although it is now clear that the birds which ant do not always use ants, but we will get to that. The bird, as observed evidently hundreds of times by now, picks up an ant in its bill and, spreading its wings, rapidly rubs the ant along, usually, the inside of its wings, which are widely extended. In this position, the quills or primaries, that is, the primary feathers, in this position, the quills or primaries of the wings are fanned. A Canadian observer, the ornithologist Roy Ivor, is quoted as saying that when the anting process is at its height, the birds seem to be afflicted with an ecstasy, toppling onto one side, or in other ways losing their balance. A similar report comes from Holger Poulsen, whose observations at the Copenhagen Zoo include those of 152 birds representing 85 species belonging to 24 families. He reports that the birds sometimes rub the ants on their tails and shoulders as well as wings, often becoming so absorbed in the task as to lose balance and fall over. These observations include birds in the wild as well as in captivity, and well might the question be asked, did birds only start anting rather recently? The obvious answer must be certainly not. And to the next question, then why was it not noticed before? The answer, not so obvious to those who have not seen it, is that it is all done very quickly, far more quickly than it takes to describe it. Probably no trained ornithologist noted it because none such was looking for it. And such is the general attitude of specialists of all kind. Observations reported by non-specialists who had noted it were brushed aside. Stories of birds applying ants to their feathers were regarded by ornithologists much as herpetologists regarded and regard stories that snakes form themselves into hoops and roll downhill, or suck the milk from cows' udders. Old wives' tales, we call it. However, young Peter Bradley was wrong in believing that the birds stow the ants in their feathers. They do not. They never let go of the ant till they have finished rubbing it. Then they either eat it or simply drop it. Furthermore, close observation shows that the ants are not used to eat the smaller insects, bird mites or bird lice, which are usually found in plumage. And, in fact, in implying that young wild turkeys wallow in old ant nests because their parasites will drop off, not liking the smell of ants, Audubon was also wrong. Audubon was also wrong. In which case or cases, why do the birds who ant? I've said a bit before that, although the name of anting is applied to such behavior, not ants alone are used. We have seen the custom of the Barbados blackbird, or tinkling grackle, if you prefer, I do not, in using bruised limes for the purpose of rubbing its feathers. Are any other items used? Oh, you bet. Herewith a partial list. Pine needles, pepperina berries, English walnuts, lemon pulp, lemon juice, vinegar and beer, orange juice, chokeberries and sumac berries, cigar stumps, roaches, shrimps, mothballs, tobacco pipe ashes, chimney smoke, a smoldering log, apple pieces or apple peel, pansy blossoms, hot chocolate, soapy dishwater, cigarettes. Perhaps this list is long enough, although probably other items are also used. It is evident that although the practice of anting may be innate or instinctive, the items used are fortuitous. That is, a bird may engage in anting with whatever it may chance to find around. As I so often quote Morris Burton as the prime source for this lecture, I will say that I know of him only that he is an Englishman, a doctor of science, and the author of several books, including Infancy in Animals, Animal Courtship, and Animal Legends, as well as Phoenix Reborn. It is in connection with his pet birds, Corby, Jasper, and Niger, that he came to write the reports which, coming to my attention, have inspired this legend. But before going into that, let us take our science-fictional time and space scanner and zoom back to the year 1934. Again, a reporter on an English provincial newspaper is reproved for bringing in a silly story. Silly stories are most common in what newspapermen call the silly season, but can turn up all around the year, any year, and may range from, I heard this one phoned in one night in the office of the old San Francisco News Call Bulletin whilst visiting, a phantom airplane crashing into the Golden Gate Bridge, There was no airplane and hence no crash. There was a bridge, though. To a cat reported to have walked 30 miles between its old home and its new. The cat had walked perhaps the 3 miles actual distance between the two houses, or perhaps had simply been away a long time on business of its own. Flying saucer stories are usually silly stories, but not always. Stories of elephants being dragged underwater by giant sharks are invariably silly stories, with the added factor of originating too far away to be tracked down. Stories of people who are 120 years old are almost invariably silly stories. As Randall Garrett once said to me, people over 112 years old always have in common that they have no birth certificate. To which I might add that if they do, it is almost certainly someone else's birth certificate. This particular silly story was about a house which caught on fire because a bird had picked up a lit cigarette and carried it up to its nest in the rain gutter of the house in question. It was explained to the reporter that such stories, though not terribly common, were terribly untrue, because birds do not pick up lit cigarettes, let alone carrying them off to their nests, cigarettes being inedible. See? I hope you see. Burton's theory is that anting is an extreme form of preening and that it is related to an extreme form of sunbathing. The bird does it because it feels good. I might go as far out on a limb as any bird and suggest that it may be remotely related to what in human beings is called fetishism, but I won't press this point. Bird anting seems also related to aspects of bird bathing. In both instances, the bird seems to go into an ecstasy, sometimes. And now I shall ask you to recall that Lactantius, in his poem on the phoenix, says that it bathes the day before it burns. I shall ask you also to recall how many of the substances, or items, rather, with which birds engage in anting are or might be considered aromatic, or anyway strong-tasting or strong-smelling substances.
God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.